Today I want to share with you a story that truly touched my heart. This account was sent to us by the very person who experienced it, someone who lived through something so profound that it changed their understanding of life and death forever. With their generous permission, I have adapted the names and locations throughout this narrative to protect their privacy and the privacy of their loved ones. But I want to make something absolutely clear. Every spiritual detail, every encounter with the divine, every revelation they received remains exactly as it happened. I have not changed a single word of the spiritual truth they experienced. The reason for these adaptations is simple. This person wants to share their transformative experience with you while maintaining their anonymity. My deepest hope is that this testimony will touch your heart, strengthen your faith in God, and help you understand that death is not something to fear. It is simply a doorway to something far more beautiful than we can imagine. May this story inspire you to live with greater faith and to trust in the eternal nature of our souls. Thomas Brennan had dedicated his entire adult life to serving others as an emergency medical responder in the mountain communities of Colorado. In 1994, he was working at Station 23, a fire and rescue facility that served the Boulder area, and he took immense pride in his work. Thomas wasn't just a firefighter and paramedic. He was someone who truly cared about every person he helped. He would go above and beyond on every call, treating each patient with dignity and compassion. Outside of work, Thomas was passionate about endurance sports. He competed regularly in triathlons and had completed multiple Ironman competitions across the country. His body was incredibly fit, his cardiovascular system operating at peak efficiency. But all of his physical strength and all of his medical training couldn't prepare him for the extraordinary event that would unfold during that cold winter season. A brutal flu outbreak had devastated the Boulder and Denver regions that year. Hospitals were completely overwhelmed, their emergency departments packed beyond capacity, with people suffering from severe respiratory illness, dangerously high fevers, and life-threatening dehydration. Thomas and his crew at Station 23 were responding to medical calls around the clock. Every shift felt endless. Every emergency transport brought them face to face with another struggling patient, another terrified family watching their loved one fight for breath. The entire medical system was stretched to its breaking point. One emergency call during that period would change Thomas's life forever. He and his partner responded to a distress call at a small residence on the outskirts of Boulder. When they arrived and entered the home, they found a woman barricaded in her bedroom. The curtains were pulled tight, blocking out all natural light. The air in the room was thick and stale. The woman was in critical condition, her breathing shallow and labored, her skin burning with fever. She had been too weak to leave the room for days, surviving on nothing but sheer willpower, until a family member finally found her and called for help. Thomas immediately went into action mode. He maneuvered across the bed to get close enough to properly position an oxygen mask over her nose and mouth. He worked with practiced precision, adjusting the elastic bands, ensuring a proper seal so she could get maximum oxygen flow. But at the exact moment he leaned in close to check that everything was secure, the woman exhaled forcefully right into his face. Thomas inhaled at that same instant. He felt the contaminated air rush straight down into his lungs. As a trained paramedic, he understood immediately what had just happened, but he stayed focused on his patient. He got her stabilized, helped load her into the ambulance, and transported her safely to the hospital. Within 48 hours, Thomas was experiencing symptoms unlike anything he had ever felt before. The illness attacked his body with overwhelming force. His temperature spiked so high that he became delirious. Every muscle in his body screamed with pain. His head throbbed with an intense pressure that made even the dimmest light unbearable. But what terrified him most was the rapid dehydration. His body couldn't retain any fluids. He was vomiting constantly, and his digestive system was purging everything from the other end as well. He could literally feel his body running dry, his strength draining away hour by hour. On the third day of this nightmare, Thomas tried to stand up from his bed. His legs buckled beneath him. He caught himself on the dresser and stumbled toward the bathroom. When he finally looked at himself in the mirror, he was shocked by what he saw. The face staring back at him looked like a corpse. His cheeks had sunken inward, creating deep shadows. His eyes sat in dark, hollow sockets. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor. He looked like a skeleton with skin stretched over it. Thomas instinctively reached for his wrist to check his radial pulse, a basic assessment he had performed thousands of times on patients throughout his career. He pressed his fingers against his wrist, searching for that familiar rhythmic throb. Nothing. He couldn't feel anything. His medical training immediately told him what this meant. His blood pressure had dropped below 80 millimeters of mercury. His heart was racing frantically, hammering away at close to 150 beats per minute, but his blood pressure was so dangerously low that the pulse in his wrist had completely disappeared. Thomas managed to get back to the bedroom and called out weakly to his family. His niece, a young woman in her early 20s who had been staying with them that week, heard his voice and came running. She took one look at him and immediately grabbed the telephone to call 911. Within 12 minutes, a Boulder County Fire Department crew arrived at the house, colleagues and friends who had worked alongside Thomas for years. They found him collapsed on the living room floor, barely responsive. Without wasting a second, they established 2 IV lines and began flooding his system with normal saline. They loaded him onto the stretcher and transported him code 3, full lights and sirens, to a major medical center in Denver, approximately 40 miles away, where they had more resources to handle critical cases during the epidemic. When Thomas arrived at the Denver Emergency Department, the scene was absolute chaos. Every hallway was lined with gurneys holding patients waiting for treatment rooms. Medical staff were running in every direction, their faces showing the strain of working 12 and 14-hour shifts day after day. Thomas was wheeled into a treatment bay, where an exhausted emergency physician was working frantically to manage an impossible patient load. The doctor had essentially implemented a standard protocol for all flu patients coming through his department. The approach was straightforward. Administer pain medication, typically a morphine derivative, and anti-nausea medication to help patients keep fluids down. The doctor was moving from patient to patient, barely looking at charts anymore. He was simply trying to keep people alive and somewhat comfortable while the epidemic ran its course. Thomas remained in that treatment bay for roughly 30 to 40 minutes. The intravenous fluids began to take effect. 2 full bags of saline solution flowed into his dehydrated system, and he started to feel marginally better. His head cleared slightly. His heart rate began to decrease. He sat up on the examination table and told his wife, who had followed the ambulance to Denver, that he thought he might be stable enough to continue treatment at home. He would be more comfortable there, he reasoned, and they could follow up with his regular physician in the morning. But the nurse who came to check on him had different instructions. She explained that hospital policy during the epidemic was clear. Every patient presenting with these particular symptoms received the standardized medication protocol before discharge. No exceptions were being made. Thomas, who had always respected medical authority and protocol, simply nodded his acceptance. He trusted the system. He had been part of that system for his entire professional life. What happened next would haunt his wife for years afterward. The nurse prepared 2 syringes, one containing Nubain, which is a powerful synthetic morphine medication, and another containing a strong anti-nausea drug. Thomas was sitting upright on the examination table, actually starting to swing his legs over the side to stand up, when the nurse administered both medications directly into his intravenous line. She injected them rapidly, pushing the entire contents of both syringes in a matter of seconds. Almost immediately, Thomas's eyes rolled backward in his head until only the whites were visible. His wife later said it looked surreal, like watching something from a horror movie. Then his entire body went completely rigid. He toppled backward onto the examination table, hitting it hard, completely unconscious, before his head touched the pillow. Instantly, the room filled with medical personnel. Doctors and nurses rushed in from every direction. They immediately recognized what had happened. Thomas was experiencing a severe adverse reaction to the medications, essentially an iatrogenic overdose. They grabbed a vial of Narcan from the crash cart and administered it intravenously. Narcan is the emergency reversal agent for opiate overdoses. It works by instantly blocking opiate receptors in the brain and throughout the body. They gave Thomas 1 dose, then quickly followed with a 2nd dose. Additional IV lines were started. The examination table was tilted into Trendelenburg position, head down, feet elevated, to try to maximize blood flow to his brain. But despite all these interventions, Thomas's condition continued to deteriorate. His blood pressure had crashed to 40/0. Essentially, his heart was still beating, but it wasn't generating anywhere near enough pressure to adequately circulate blood through his body. The medical team made the decision to transfer him immediately to the intensive care unit. They worked on him throughout the entire night, monitoring his vital signs, adjusting medications, doing everything possible to keep him alive. When morning came and the attending physician made rounds, he explained to Thomas's wife exactly what had happened from a physiological perspective. The morphine-based medication Thomas received had caused massive vasodilation throughout his circulatory system. "Imagine your blood vessels as a network of tubes filled with fluid," the doctor explained. "Under normal circumstances, those tubes maintain a certain diameter, and there's enough blood volume inside to fill them and create the pressure necessary for proper circulation. But the medication Thomas received caused all of his blood vessels to dilate dramatically. The walls of the tubes expanded significantly. Suddenly, the volume of blood in his body, which had already been depleted by days of dehydration, was insufficient to fill the expanded vascular space. His blood pressure collapsed catastrophically, and his body began shutting down. The doctor told her that the only reason Thomas was probably still alive was his extraordinary cardiovascular fitness from years of competitive triathlon training. His heart and circulatory system were so efficient at oxygen delivery that even with critically low blood pressure, his vital organs had managed to receive just barely enough oxygen to avoid complete failure. Thomas never regained consciousness in any normal sense during that long night in intensive care. But sometime between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, when his physical body lay motionless on that hospital bed, something absolutely extraordinary occurred. He left his body. The experience began with a sensation he would struggle to describe for the rest of his life. It felt as though he had been imprisoned inside a tiny, hot, suffocating box for as long as he could remember, and suddenly the walls of that box simply dissolved. He was released into infinite space, into boundless freedom. The relief was so overwhelming, so complete, that it brought him to tears of joy. He found himself floating in a vast expanse filled with enormous glowing spheres of different colors. These weren't stars as we understand them. They were conscious beings, entities of pure light and energy, and they radiated unconditional love and welcome. He understood instinctively that these were what some people call light beings or orbs, but experiencing them directly was nothing like reading descriptions in books. It was real, immediate, and more beautiful than anything he had ever imagined. Thomas himself no longer had a physical form. He had become a vast, expanded field of consciousness without boundaries or limitations. The sensation was indescribably pleasurable. It was like every nerve in his being, though he didn't have nerves anymore, was flooded with pure bliss. If he had to compare it to anything physical, he said it felt like warm, golden liquid being poured directly into his consciousness and then flowing outward through every aspect of his existence, bringing everything alive with joy and ecstasy. The pleasure was so intense that it made every good feeling he had ever experienced in his physical life seem like a faint shadow by comparison. It was like comparing a candle flame to the sun. As he moved through this space, flying, floating, simply being, surrounded by these welcoming, loving beings, a profound realization struck him with the force of a lightning bolt. How had he forgotten? How was it possible that he had been so completely convinced that he was Thomas Brennan, a paramedic from Colorado, with a career and relationships and daily worries and concerns? Because in this moment, in this place, he knew with absolute unshakable certainty that all of that was ultimately an illusion. His true identity, his real self, was this vast consciousness, this eternal being of light. The human life, the physical existence, the personality and memories of Thomas Brennan, all of it was like a costume he had put on, a role he had played, and he had gotten so absorbed in the performance that he had completely forgotten he was acting. The physical world, with all its drama and pain and worry, was a temporary game, an elaborate simulation that came with being born into a material body. But this this place of light and love and infinite consciousness, this was home. This was reality. This was who he really was. After what seemed like both an instant and an eternity, time didn't operate normally in that realm. Thomas felt himself landing somewhere. The sensation of floating through space stopped, and he became aware of standing on something solid. He looked around and saw that he was inside some kind of structure. It had walls that seemed to glow with soft, indirect illumination from no identifiable source. There were tables positioned around the space, and equipment of various kinds that he couldn't quite identify or understand. The place felt organized, but also somehow playful, like a workshop where joyful work was being done. And then he noticed them, 3 short beings standing directly in front of him, watching him with evident delight. These 3 beings were unlike anything Thomas had ever seen or imagined. They stood maybe 3.5 to 4 feet tall with stocky, solid builds. They wore dark robes or cloaks with hoods, but the hoods were pulled back far enough that Thomas could see their faces clearly. They looked almost like mythical gnomes or dwarves, with round faces and bright, sparkling eyes, and they were smiling. Huge, genuine smiles that radiated pure joy and playfulness. Their eyes twinkled with mischief and intelligence and profound love. They reminded Thomas of children who were bursting with excitement to share a secret, except these beings were clearly ancient and infinitely wise. The 3 beings immediately began peppering Thomas with questions, speaking in overlapping voices that had a musical, almost giggling quality. "How was it down there?" one asked eagerly. "Tell us everything," another exclaimed. "What did you discover? What did you learn?" the third one chimed in. They were practically bouncing with enthusiasm, like friends greeting someone who had just returned from an amazing adventure. Thomas stood there feeling somewhat disoriented. He had a strange sense that he should know these beings, that they were familiar to him on some deep level, but his memory felt foggy and unclear. He tried to gather his thoughts to respond to their questions. Then one of the 3 turned to his companions, gestured toward Thomas with an amused expression, and said something that made all 3 of them burst into delighted laughter. "He doesn't remember us," the being announced, and they all found this absolutely hilarious. They laughed and nudged each other, thoroughly enjoying the situation. Thomas wanted to protest, wanted to say that he did sort of remember them, that there was something familiar about them, but before he could form the words, his attention was drawn to another presence approaching. This new being was completely different from the 3 hooded figures. He was extraordinarily tall and impossibly slender, with a form that appeared to be composed of translucent mist or vapor rather than solid matter. He reminded Thomas of a stretched, elongated version of those flexible clay animation characters, or perhaps like a very tall, thin cactus, except his entire body seemed to be made of swirling fog or smoke. When this being moved, it was mesmerizing to observe. Different parts of his form would drift apart slightly and then flow back together, like watching someone move underwater where currents catch their clothing and create beautiful, fluid patterns. Despite his unusual appearance, he had a distinct face, and that face wore the most beautiful, warm, genuine smile Thomas had ever witnessed. His eyes were extraordinary, luminous and filled with such intense, overwhelming love that Thomas could barely stand to look directly at them. This tall, misty being appeared to be supervising the operation, though supervising doesn't quite capture the right feeling. There was no sense of rigid authority or hierarchy. Everything felt joyful and collaborative, like everyone was participating in something wonderful together. When the tall being came close to Thomas, something powerful happened. Thomas felt his chest expand dramatically, as if his heart was growing too large for his body cavity. Simultaneously, his throat constricted and tightened. A wave of overwhelming emotion crashed over him. He felt like he was going to break down into uncontrollable sobbing, not from sadness or pain, but from the sheer overwhelming intensity of the love radiating from this being. It was love so pure, so unconditional, so infinite, that it was almost too much for Thomas to bear. It felt like standing in the direct beam of divine love, being bathed in it, drowning in it in the most beautiful way possible. The scene in this space was surprisingly informal and unstructured. The 3 little hooded beings kept giggling amongst themselves, occasionally whispering to each other and then bursting into more laughter. The tall, misty being just stood there radiating that overwhelming love, smiling gently, occasionally chuckling at something. After a while, Thomas decided to take some initiative in the situation. He looked up at the tall being and said, "Well, I'm obviously not going back there, so should we proceed with whatever comes next? I've heard about life reviews. Is that what we're going to do now?" He had read about life reviews in accounts of near-death experiences, the idea that you witness your entire life played back and experience the consequences of all your choices and actions. The tall being's response caught Thomas completely off guard. He threw his head back and laughed, a deep, rich, joyful laugh that seemed to come from the very core of his being. It was the kind of laugh that made you want to laugh along even if you didn't know what was funny. When the laughter subsided, the being looked at Thomas with those impossibly loving eyes and said, "Sure, absolutely. Let's do that. Where would you like to begin?" The casualness of it stunned Thomas. This didn't match any of the formal, serious life review processes he had read about. Wasn't there supposed to be some kind of structured evaluation, some serious accounting? But the being's attitude was so relaxed, so friendly, that Thomas simply went along with it. He began sharing a few memories from his life, but nothing particularly dramatic or significant emerged. There were no terrible regrets, no major sins requiring judgment or redemption. He mentioned one thing that came to mind. Several years earlier, there had been an opportunity for him to take a position as a backcountry ranger in Rocky Mountain National Park. His wife had been really excited about the possibility. They would have spent an entire summer living in a remote cabin, surrounded by wilderness, away from the pressures and stress of emergency response work. But Thomas had turned down the position, choosing instead to stay with the fire department, where he felt he could make more of a difference saving lives. Looking back now, he wished he had taken that ranger job. It would have been a beautiful experience, a peaceful season with his wife in the mountains. That was honestly the only significant regret that came up. The tall being listened patiently, nodding occasionally, his expression gentle and understanding. When Thomas finished speaking, the being smiled warmly and said, "All right, that's sufficient. It's time for you to go back now." The words hit Thomas like ice water. "Go back?" He stared at the being in disbelief. "Go back?" he repeated, his voice rising. "No, absolutely not. I'm not going back there. Are you serious? I'm finally home. I'm finally where I belong." But the tall being's demeanor remained gentle yet immovable. "No," he said simply. "You have important work still to do. You're going back." Thomas suddenly noticed that the three little hooded beings had vanished. They had simply disappeared, presumably called away to other tasks in whatever this place was. Now it was just Thomas and the tall, misty being. The being moved closer, and Thomas knew he had to make one final attempt to stay. He looked up desperately and said, "Listen, please. The only people who will really miss me are my wife and my parents. Yes, they'll be sad for a while, but they're incredibly strong people. They'll grieve and then they'll heal and they'll move forward with their lives. They'll be okay. I don't need to go back." Thomas thought this was a reasonable argument, but the tall being simply found it touching and amusing. He smiled even more warmly and said again with finality, "No, you're going back." In that instant, everything around Thomas began to dissolve. It was like watching a television image fragment and break apart when you switch channels or lose signal. The walls, the tables, the equipment, the glowing light, everything started to disintegrate and fade away. Thomas understood intuitively what was happening. He was being shifted to a different frequency of existence. He realized in that moment that all of reality, everything that exists, operates on different vibrational frequencies like stations on a radio dial. You can have completely different dimensions and realities occupying the same space, just vibrating at different rates. He felt himself descending, sinking downward through layers of reality, and it was a distinct sensation of lowering, of decreasing vibration. The tall being faded away like morning mist evaporating in sunlight, and Thomas fell into darkness. As he descended toward his physical body, as he dropped down through these layers or frequencies of reality, he passed through a realm that filled him with profound dread. For years afterward, He hesitated to mention this part of his experience, but eventually he realized it was important for people to know. There exists a place, a dimension very close to our physical world, that you absolutely do not want to visit or linger in. It vibrates at a frequency just slightly different from our material reality, and it is a place of terrible loneliness and desolation. It is grey and empty and cold. There is no love there, no light, no connection, no hope. It's a realm of isolation and quiet despair. Thomas felt it pulling at him as he passed through it, and he wanted nothing whatsoever to do with it. It served as a stark reminder that not all non-physical dimensions are beautiful and welcoming. Some are dark and frightening, and souls can become trapped there if they're not careful. Then, abruptly, he was back in his physical body. The sensation was jarring and uncomfortable, like being forced back into a prison cell that was far too small and confining. He remained unconscious for several more hours. When he finally began to wake up, it happened gradually, in stages. His first awareness was of mechanical beeping sounds, medical monitoring equipment. He managed to open his eyes just a fraction and saw machines all around him, tubes and wires connected to his body. He focused his attention on one particular monitor, displaying his blood pressure. It read 46/0. He stared at it for a few moments, processing the information, then slipped back into unconsciousness. Some time later, he woke again briefly. The blood pressure reading had improved. It now showed 62/28. He felt a small flicker of relief before darkness claimed him once more. This pattern repeated itself several times, brief moments of awareness where he would check the monitor and see the numbers slowly climbing into the 70s, then back into unconsciousness. Eventually, a nurse entered the room during one of his conscious moments and saw his eyes open. "Oh my goodness, you're awake," she exclaimed, her voice filled with surprise and relief. Thomas looked at her and said weakly, "I need to talk to you about something." The nurse shook her head. "First, I need to notify the doctor," she explained. "You've been unconscious for many hours. We honestly weren't certain you were going to survive. The doctor needs to know immediately that you're responsive." But Thomas reached out and gently touched her arm. "Please, just for a moment," he said. "I need to understand something. Why am I back here? I was somewhere else. I was home, with beings I've known forever. How did I end up back in this body, in this hospital room?" The nurse pulled up a chair and sat down beside his bed. She had probably witnessed many things during her nursing career, but something about Thomas's earnest confusion touched her heart. Thomas continued, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I thought I had died. I was absolutely certain of it. I was in a place that was more real than this room, more real than anything I've ever experienced in my entire life, and now I'm back here and I honestly don't understand why." The nurse reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. She looked into his eyes with compassion and said, "Sweetheart, you came very close. You were in escrow, as we say, but the deal fell through. Now you're back with us here in the land of the living, and you're just going to have to adjust to that reality and get on with recovering." Thomas appreciated her honesty and her kindness, but her words didn't bring him much comfort. Throughout the next several days of his hospital recovery, he experienced a deep, persistent sadness. It wasn't the kind of clinical depression that requires medication. He could still function normally, could engage in conversation, could cooperate with the medical staff and physical therapists. But underneath all of that was a profound sense of loss and mourning. He grieved for that other place, that realm of pure love and limitless joy and complete freedom. He could feel the memory beginning to fade already, which intensified his sadness. It was like trying desperately to hold on to a dream after waking up, feeling the details slip away no matter how hard you try to grasp them. He knew that eventually he might even begin to question whether it had really happened, might start telling himself it was just a hallucination caused by medication and oxygen deprivation. But Thomas refused to let the experience be forgotten or dismissed, so he started talking about it openly. He told everyone he encountered. He told his fellow firefighters and paramedics at the station. He told friends, family members, neighbors, anyone who would listen. He told them all the same essential message. Listen to me carefully. Death is not something to fear. We have completely misunderstood what it is. It's not an ending or a tragedy. It's a transition to something infinitely better. It's like graduating to a higher level of existence. It happens instantly. It's beautiful beyond description, and there is absolutely nothing to be afraid of. Over the months and years that followed, people who were struggling with grief and loss would seek Thomas out. A colleague whose teenage son had died in a car accident. A friend whose mother had passed away from cancer. People who were drowning in sorrow and couldn't imagine how they would ever feel whole again. Thomas would sit with each of them and share what he had learned. You need to understand something fundamental. Nobody actually dies. That's the truth that changes everything. When someone we love passes away, we haven't lost them. They've simply stepped out of their physical body and returned home. They're still completely themselves, still the person you loved, still carrying their personality and all their memories and all their love for you. They're just existing in a different dimension now, at a different frequency, and they're much closer than you realize. They're actually right here beside you. You can't see them with your physical eyes, but they're present. Thomas would explain to grieving people that when he left his body and traveled through those spiritual realms, his core identity remained completely intact. His personality, his sense of humor, his way of thinking, the internal voice that narrates your thoughts and makes observations and cracks jokes, all of that was still there. The transition was seamless. He didn't become a different person or lose himself. He just stepped out of his physical form and continued being Thomas, just in a different state of being. And if that was true for him, it was true for everyone. Every person who has ever died is still fundamentally themselves, still conscious and aware, just no longer confined to a physical body. They haven't gone anywhere, really. They're just vibrating at a frequency we can't perceive with our physical senses. This message brought profound comfort to many people who were suffering. Several people told Thomas that his testimony had literally saved their lives, that they had been considering suicide to escape their grief, but his words gave them hope and helped them find the strength to carry on. Thomas felt deeply that this was part of his purpose, part of why he had been sent back, to share this truth, to help people understand that death is not the tragedy and ending we've been taught to believe it is. But then came the pushback. After several months of openly sharing his story, a co-worker approached Thomas one afternoon. The man was diplomatic about it, but his message was unmistakable. "Hey Thomas, listen," he said, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted to give you a friendly warning. Some people around here are starting to talk. They're saying you've been acting strange, that maybe the experience affected you more than you realize. Some folks think you might benefit from talking to a counselor or something. I'm just saying, you might want to be a bit more careful about who you share this stuff with." The words stung deeply. Here was Thomas, sharing what he genuinely believed was the most important, hopeful, liberating truth that any human being could possibly hear. Proof that death is not the end, that we don't really lose the people we love, that there's a beautiful existence waiting for everyone, and he was being told to keep quiet about it because it made people uncomfortable or seemed crazy. Thomas remembered hearing about similar situations. He knew that throughout history, people who had profound spiritual experiences often faced ridicule or worse when they tried to share what they had learned. He was facing a choice: continue speaking his truth and risk his reputation and career, or stay silent and keep the experience to himself. Reluctantly, painfully, Thomas made the decision to stop talking about it publicly. He closed his mouth and locked the experience away deep inside himself. For the next 15 years, he barely mentioned it to anyone. He went back to work, continued his career in emergency services, competed in his athletic events, lived what appeared to be a normal life. But the memory of that night in 1994 never truly left him. It was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting. Then in 2010, Thomas retired from active service. He was in his mid-50s by that point, ready to begin a new phase of his life, but as soon as he stopped working, as soon as he had time to sit quietly and reflect, without the constant demands of emergency calls and training exercises, the memory of his near-death experience came flooding back with overwhelming force. It was as if it had been dormant, held at bay by the busyness and structure of his working life, and now it demanded his full attention. Thomas became consumed with finding answers and deeper understanding of what had happened to him. He began an intensive personal research project, reading everything he could find about near-death experiences, consciousness studies, spirituality, and ancient wisdom traditions from cultures around the world. He discovered that many traditional societies, the mystics, the shamans, the indigenous wisdom keepers, had preserved knowledge about the nature of reality and consciousness that modern Western civilization had largely forgotten, dismissed, or actively suppressed. But that journey of discovery is a story for another time. What matters most for today is the core truth that Thomas wanted everyone to know. Death is not what we have been taught to believe. It is not an ending, not a tragedy, not something to dread or fear with anxiety. It is a transition, a homecoming, a return to our true nature as eternal beings of consciousness and love. The people we have loved and lost are not truly gone. Our beloved pets who have died have not ceased to exist. They are all still here, living in frequencies and dimensions just slightly different from our own, still themselves, still aware and conscious, still filled with love for us. And one day, when our own time comes to leave these temporary physical bodies behind, we will join them in that realm of light and love and infinite joy. That is Thomas Brennan's testimony, and his deepest hope is that by sharing his story, he can bring comfort, peace, and hope to anyone who needs to hear it.